80 years ago, Wing Commander Joseph Watts was killed when his RAF Hampden Bomber crashed as it returned from a bombing raid in occupied Europe. He left behind a daughter and also an unborn son. John Watts, born 8 months later, would never meet his father. But recently he discovered that here, at the RAF Museum in Cosford, they have one of the very few surviving Hampdens. And this one is from the very squadron his father flew in. Today, he's going to see the plane for the very first time. But first, I asked him to tell me a little bit about his family.
My mother and father lived in Lincoln, on the outskirts of Lincoln. And first of all, he was at Waddington, but I think at the beginning of the war, he went up to Wick in Scotland. And then they flew down for Christmas in 1940, and the weather was atrocious. And my mother and all the other wives thought that the squadrons wouldn't come. But of course, they buzzed the gardens. They flew very low indeed. And you know what the sound of a bomber is like, even a Hampden bomber, huge.
Well, how old was he?
He was very old. He was, at that point, 32.
Oh, wow.
A veteran.
Grizzled veteran.
But of course, he was a regular, and he joined the RAF in 1932, I think, learnt to fly out in Abu Swa in Egypt, and then he was in the Northwest Frontier Campaign, which figures on the medals, of course. That's the one, Northwest Frontier, in the campaign against the Fakir of Ipi.
What is your mother and their friends, what have they told you about his attitude to flying? I mean, did he just love it? Was it a calling?
He loved it. He loved it. He was in his element. He was a speed merchant, really. He was the opposite of his son sitting here. Very technical and very good at maths and an all-round athlete, and he just loved speed. My mother said that he drove the MG as fast as the aeroplane, and they used to quarrel mightily. They had a very Petruchio, Catherine kind of relationship, but they adored each other.
It became obvious quite early in the war, in fact from the earliest days of the war, that being in Bomber Command was very, very dangerous. Is that something that he and your mother would have been aware of, talked about over that lovely Christmas of 1939 to 40?
Absolutely. They never balked it. At the same time, as I'm sure you've heard many times, they made light of it. I mean, the men, and my father was always joking, but they talked about the nitty-gritty. He said that he wouldn't be able to carry on if he didn't know that she was going to get a pension. He knew that he was likely to die, I think, but I mean, they were very light-hearted. He did say to my mother, if there's a funeral, don't bother to go, because they'll jumble a few bones together and they'll put in what they can. And he made light of it. You know, he made a joke out of it. He said, there'll be nothing there that you'll be saying goodbye to that you know. And of course it came to pass. And indeed my mother didn't go to his funeral. She wouldn't go to Buckingham Palace to collect his DSO, which he knew about. He knew it was on the way, I'm happy to say. But she coped by turning her back on it all. But oh yes, they discussed everything. And of course it was very clear and obvious to my mother when his friends began to just disappear night after night. Robson was one who'd been leaning on the mantelpiece, drinking, laughing, and then a couple of nights later was gone. And then my mother realized that it was his war, personally, in a way. My mother said that only once in her presence, only once, did he actually break down after a particularly dreadful night. I think that was the raid on Kristiansand, when half the squadron was lost. And of course, he was commander and squadron leader. 12 of them went out, 6 of them got back, including friends, well, of course, you know. And you know how close these crews were.
He, as well as managing his own aircraft and doing his own job, he was also mindful of everybody else on the squadron. He's taking so much on.
Yes, yes. The strain of doing that must have been immense, I would imagine.
Must have been exhausting.
Indeed, my mother describes, she's written about all these matters, by the way, and she describes him coming in and just falling on the sofa, dead asleep, and sleeping for hours, and then having to go off immediately. And at one time, the doctor came and said, you know, you must let him sleep as much as he can. We need him, and he's totally exhausted.
But there was time for one bit of a brief moment of light entertainment.
Absolutely. He got home, and my dear mother, she wrote about it, and I think she described it as a last hot, hasty rendezvous with love. And the result is sitting in front of you today. I was born 8 months after he died. So I was conceived in the last days of his life. And indeed, my mother said to him, she had wanted a second child. My sister is nearly 6 years older. She's 5.5 years older. And my mother had said, Jack, I'm sure I'm pregnant. You know, I've got that feeling, and I'm late, and I know it. And their very last words to each other, he rang up from the aerodrome and said, well, darling, we're off. And then he said, if you haven't heard from me by 11 o'clock tomorrow, you'll know I've had it. And then his last words were, are you still all right? All wrong, I mean. And he is joking about what she thought. And indeed, the next day, she went with her sister to have coffee in Lincoln and sort of forgot 11 o'clock coming and going. It was a beautiful day in June. She went back to the house, and the staff car was standing outside, and she knew immediately. And within a week, she had sold his car, got lodgers in upstairs, got a job. That's the sort of way they carried on, as you know.
Does it make you happy to think that as he took off on that final mission, he was thinking about that little baby growing inside his wife?
Tremendously, tremendously. I'm hugely encouraged by that. And obviously, somebody like me, and there are thousands of us, as you well know. I mean, I sit here today, I feel, with hundreds, if not thousands, behind me of similar ones. Every day is a plus for us, obviously. We were so lucky to be made, as it were.
John had never heard his father's voice until he saw this extraordinary piece of newsreel footage in which his father is interviewed.
Back from Sylt come the crews of the bombers who plastered the lair of the mine-laying seaplanes with some of their own explosive medicine.
Did you have a good trip? One of the best we ever had, because we were allowed to do something this time.
Less than 3 months after this was filmed, Joseph Watts was killed in action. What do you know about your father's last mission?
Nothing beyond the fact that it was going to some canals. But I don't know. And not only do I not know, but I've heard different versions of his death. My mother, I do not know whether she ever knew the real truth. She certainly didn't at the time. The report was missing in a flying battle, presumed killed. Well, flying battle, as you know, was a favourite phrase of Bomber Harris. And it wasn't a battle, not for those bomber boys. They were coming back through long, difficult hours, just trying not to be picked off by the Messerschmitts. My mother's version was, first of all, that, missing. And of course, we as little children, we always used to think, oh, he might come home. He might be out there in Germany fighting away like Biggles or Colditz in disguise. And that's what my sister and I would talk about. And she, as a little thing, she wasn't quite 5. She was told that Daddy had gone on a long journey, which is what they told them in those days. But for me, he's always been a wonderful, bright, happy ghost, because our mother evoked him all the time, which is why I call him Daddy, although I never said Daddy to anybody in front of me. But he lives for me through all these wonderful tales. He was a great rip-roaring person who roared into the room and rather took over.
Do you think it was harder for your sister?
It was more than hard for my sister. She adored her father idolatrously, and he was very naughty. He loved her and made huge fuss, took her into the mess. She would dance on the counter in the mess, and she was a most beautiful, engaging little creature. He absolutely adored her. So suddenly he was snatched away. Suddenly this horrid brute arrived. Suddenly she was 6 years old and in boarding school. And I think people don't really recover from that totally. No, it was very hard for her. Easy for me, Dan, because, you know, I just had this wonderful, bright, lively father in the background cheering me on.
And for your mum, you mentioned she immediately tried to crack on, and but did she ever recover in some sense from what she'd suffered? Yeah.
No. I don't think people do. It was the love of her life, quite clearly. I've read my father's love letters to her when they met on Hastings Pier when they were 19, both of them. And wow, coup de foudre, it really was. And she didn't recover, but she had such spirit. Everybody thought she was this wonderful, eccentric woman full of fun. Again, rather like my father, who swept everybody along. But all the time, I know she grieved very deeply. And she made a huge effort and succeeded in keeping her grief from us children. Now, in the long perspective, one can understand it. And she wrote a lot of poetry and other things, and I've been sorting her poems out, and the grief is so clear, as well as the radiant love.
June 1940. A memory of shoulders wearing lightly, bravely, the tunic blue. The roar of squadrons already roaring out over our last farewell. The strong hand gathered, pressed me hard against the dear familiar surge of blue, holding to him extra tightly the atom in me on which we pinned such hope and love. A brother or a sister?
My dad has played such a huge part of my life. I can't really imagine not having him. Do you think what might have been if your dad had survived and played the part of a dad as you were growing up?
Oh yes. What I did was to turn all my school teachers, the male ones, into dads. I had some very good relationships with my teachers. I was lucky. A bit of a goody-goody, I suppose. But and they, I think, understood, because they were all the wartime generation. Most of them had been through the war, and they were ready to be rather fatherly. I think, if he'd survived, would that man, after those horrific experiences, would he have been the man he was in the late 1930s? Would he have been bright and energetic and full of fun and nonsense and games and roaring about? Who's to know? So I do wonder about that. Also, I'm a very different kind of person. I may evoke him at times, but I can't imagine what that relationship would have been like. I met his sister only once. What my mother did, her way, was to turn her back on the whole family, on all the ritual, on the RAF, on all of this panoply that we have about us today, which is why today is important to me. She turned her back. But But his sister came to meet me at school just once, and along a long corridor, she looked across and burst into tears because she could see her beloved brother.
It's so interesting as we think about the 80th anniversary of your father's death and the Battle of Britain, and then we talk about the numbers and the pilots. It's amazing that those ripples of grief are still being felt by you and your sister by today, even after 80 years. It's still, the trauma is still affecting all of us.
It's kind of crazy in a way, but it's a tribute to the human spirit, isn't it, that we are able to be so loyal. And you've seen this before, Dan, I know you must have done. And any of the others like me would be the same. It doesn't take much to trigger that grief. It's always there.
Darren Priday has spent months restoring a Hampden Bomber that was recovered from Russia. It's this plane that John has come to see. Why do you want to see the plane? Just that inanimate object?
I think it connects with the questions you were asking earlier about what my father means to me, what grief is, what it's like not to have a father, what it is to be in this peculiar situation of being very aware of someone and very proud of them, but having no tangible connections beyond the little mementos and all my mother's stories and my sister's stories. So I think I'm trotting around that overworked word closure. It's not quite that, but I've wanted to see it all my life. I've been aware of these planes. I remember the sound of the bombers during the war. I remember we lived in Mayfair. My mother moved to London. We were right in the midst of it. I remember waking up and hearing this deep, huge drone of a noise, filling the whole world for a little boy. Also, of course, to be quite honest, one wonders what his death was like, and we will never know. And there are these varying versions about it. First of all, killed in a flying battle, or missing, believed killed in a flying. That's the first thing. Well, it wasn't that. Then, when my mother eventually told me what she thought had happened, I had to give her a stiff drink beforehand and sit her down. And it was towards the end of her life. And she maintained that the story was that his plane had come in over Harwich and hadn't given any signals and was in the wrong place, and that the outline of a Hampden was similar to that of a Dornier, and it was shot down, friendly fire. That didn't happen. I then asked Uncle Halley what happened, and he told me the truth, that the plane had gone into the barrage balloons over Harwich, and the port wing had been sliced off and was uncontrolled, went down. And Guy Gibson describes this happening and said that the poor old Watts, his funeral pyre burned for 2 days and 2 nights. It went into a granary at Felixstowe and burned for 2 days and 2 nights. I think my mother knew. I think she shielded us from all of that.
I'm interested in the nature of the death, the fact that it was sort of accidental, if you like, over Harwich, rather than sort of in the teeth of a firefight over occupied Europe. Do you think that made a difference to people? Was there a sort of better way to go down than one way better than another?
I suppose officially, which is what we all knew about for many years, officially they didn't want it to be known that the RAF was making mistakes like that, which of course they were. They were learning all the time. And so I think putting a good gloss on is why it came out the way it did. And I don't think beyond that it's a matter of a good death or a bad death. But I'll tell you one thing that I think is relevant to what you're asking in an odd way, it doesn't quite seem a follow-up, but my father told my mother, among many things, that when an enemy plane, this is early in the war, when an enemy plane went down in front of him, sometimes the pilot would salute as his plane spiraled to his death. And my mother describes it as one greeting of one valiant foe to another. It sounds like Agincourt or Cressy, doesn't it, rather than 1940. But I think once they were dead, there was a kind of nobility that grew up round the memory.
And there must have been a fraternity if you're in the sky, shot, bearing all that risk. And
can you imagine? Close, I mean, unbelievably close, unbelievably close. And my mother always said that. It was a kind of, not only was it an intense fraternity, but also all about them. There was this sense of glamour from the outside. The schoolgirls would jump on the bonnet of his car and they always shout out, "Squaddy, squaddy." And they were like heroes, although they were Bomber Command, they weren't heroes later on, but then they were these glamorous, the most glamorous people in the world. So I think that kind of glamour clung to them.
So sitting here now, your journey is 99.9% complete towards this aircraft that connected with your father. How are you feeling this morning approaching that being reunited with it?
Dan, I've prefigured it so many times that I have absolutely no idea how it will hit me. I know it will hit me. I know how even small things hit me to do with this subject. And thank you for letting me air it today.
Now in his 80th year, John will finally come face to face with a Hampden bomber from his father's squadron, the most complete example anywhere in the world.
Look at Sorry, forgive me. It's marvellous. It's marvellous. It's quite marvellous. God, how narrow it is. The flying suitcase. Oh, there he is.
So that would have been your father's seat?
Yes. And it could come down. I mean, if he had been wounded and they needed to pull it, or died, and they could with great difficulty pull him out.
Darren thinks it's possible that John's father could have trained to fly in this very aircraft.
When he converted to Hampdens, this was built, I reckon this came out in about December 1939, and then went to the OTU.
He might have done.
And it was when he would have been on the OTU learning to fly a Hampden. That's when he could have met this aeroplane.
Yes, he could have done.
Because this one went on to 144 Squadron in sometime in 1942.
So yeah, a while later.
But he wouldn't. Yes, so he just in learning and in training.
He may have spotted it.
He might have done. Yes.
But you also get a sense, standing here looking at that cockpit, just how exhilarating it must have been. Your father must have loved sitting in that seat and flying this aircraft.
Oh yes.
With his squadron around him.
Yes. Oh, I think he was in his element. When I asked Uncle Halley, Wing Commander Halley Watts, the one time I met him, about flying, I said, it must be very complex. He said, not at all. No, it's just the same as driving a car, but with one more dimension.
Is it pleasing to think that he died doing something he absolutely loved?
Yes. 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 I often wonder how those men who have survived did survive and what the rest of their lives were like. But he was of the RAF. He'd have stayed. He'd have been high ranking. I'd have had a very puckered childhood, rather different from the one I did have, I'm sure. And we would have been posted to all those places that your service families get posted to.
You said you'd imagined this moment many times. How does this compare to what you'd imagined?
Remarkably controlled. I feel very prosaic about it, as if I've thought about these places as a solid working place in which my father happened to die, but it spent a great deal of incredibly intense life. It feels very actual, very on the ground. I thought I would feel it as some kind of dream or nightmare. Not at all. It feels very practical, almost mundane, but at a deep, deep level, hugely moving, hugely. It's the nearest thing to being able to say hello to your own father. I think that's what I would say about it. I've imagined myself here so many times, Dan. This is the nearest I'll be to my father.
Just try that. They will move initially, but they'll.
John wants to get a closer look at the cockpit.
Okay, that's lovely. It feels as stable as can be. Thank you. Gosh. Dan, when the port wing was ripped off, the last moments of their life, you can see how huge it is, isn't it? But it would have been behind him, and the last thing he saw.
There would have been no chance of bailing out or safely landing the plane.
No.
It would have been such a catastrophe.
It was uncontrollable. Only part of the wing was sheer up, part of the wing. Quite enough to send them down. My mother said that, in a sense, they never talked about serious things. And at the same time, she told me that, they said, if I die, this will be the situation. Make sure the children are well educated. You will get a pension. Don't go to the funeral. That'll be a farce. So they did. Okay, they didn't talk metaphysically, I think was what she meant, or philosophically or religiously or spiritually even at all.
Practical.
Yes.
I was just thinking my kids are reaching the age now when they're realising their dad is a bit of an idiot. And you've never been through that. So for you, your dad will always shines unburnished.
Yes, he's perfect. He's on the wall. He's behind the gongs. And actually, that one picture of him I don't like, because it's almost like an icon. It's impersonal. He's wearing his forage cap, and I prefer pictures of him with animals and running around, as a dad would. But no, I've been extremely lucky. And the RAF Benevolent Fund helped with my education, and my sister and I were looked after in that way. So I've always felt hugely welcomed in the world, hugely blessed, and behind me is this bright ghost. He's a bright ghost.
I watched him down the hill, my life contained beneath that tunic, the forage cap jauntily poised, the four-lined cuff. Before early summer dawn, over the Belgian bridges,
he fought with his crew, desperately for England and died.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.